Alan, thanks for joining me today. We obviously have had lots of discussions about ESG, the importance thereof in the context of another area where we work together, which is the area of valuation standard setting. So it's good to be speaking to you about ESG again. I know it's a topic we both think is very important. So, but today you're going to be joining us in the context of your role as the president of IFAC. So maybe if you can just start out and quickly give us an overview of what it is that IFAC does. Maybe all of our listeners aren't familiar with the organization.
Sure. Thank you, Andres. And it's good that we are engaging on such an important topic. So IFAC, or the International Federation of Accountants, is the global body for the accountancy profession. We represent over 3 million professional accountants around the world through our 180 member bodies across about 135 countries. And our mission simply is to serve the public interest by enhancing the relevance, the reputation, and indeed the value of the accountancy profession across the world. And we do this by representing and advocating for the profession as its global voice. And the other thing we do is we support the development and promote the adoption and implementation of high quality international standards, both for audit and assurance and for ethics for professional accountants, wherever they work, whether they're in business, whether they are auditors and those who provide assurance services, or indeed professional accountants that work in the public sector or the NGO sector, so the not-for-profit sector. And the other thing we do, increasingly very important, is that we are equipping the profession through our member bodies and all professionals that they represent to be prepared and relevant for the future. So it's quite an interesting piece of very important work we do to try to ensure that the profession is seen as a value to society at large. And we can do this through the outreach we have both ourselves, but also more importantly, through 180 member bodies across the world.
So obviously many of our viewers today are based in the U.S. and as an international organization, what role do you play in the U.S. markets?
Well, it just so happens that we're also based in the U.S. So IFAC is actually headquartered in New York. And we've been there since I think 1977. So we've been part of the U.S. scene for over 40 years. What we do, I mean, apart from, of course, having very strong relationships with the AICPA, which is a very large and important global member organization, and the Institute for Management Accountants, which is also based in the US, we also build very strong relationships with international and national organizations. So, for example, we have network partnership relationships with the World Bank, with the IMF, because we support the funding of the development of the profession, particularly in fragile states and the lesser developed countries around the world. We have a very good relationship with the SEC relating to the oversight of the two independent standard setting boards that I mentioned, the IASB for audit assurance and the ISPA for ethics. And so we work both through our member bodies in the US as part of the 135 that I've already mentioned, but also the international organizations that are based in the US to amplify the voice of the profession and also work collaboratively with the international organizations to make sure there's sufficient funding to build the capacity of the profession, particularly, as I said earlier, in the fragile states around the world and the lesser developed countries. Because we do know that as a global profession, our weakest link is the weakest member of the IFAC family, and therefore our job is to raise the standard right across the world.
So maybe turning to ESG, which I know is an area that IFAC has been very focused on recently. So maybe as an international organization, there's obviously a lot of things going on with respect to ESG, particularly I'd say the environmental part in many territories around the world. And in some respects, in Europe, for example, things are moving very quickly as it relates to new laws, regulations, reporting standards, et cetera. So maybe can you give a little bit of perspective on, if I'm a U.S. company and maybe I don't have significant operations outside of the U.S., should I still be following these developments that are happening overseas as it relates to ESG?
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question, but a very important question. The way I see the world today is that all companies in one way or another are part of a global system, whether they're in financial services in their national territory like the US, or whether they're in manufacturing, or indeed whether they're in services. They rely on or supply services to other organizations, both nationally and internationally. So therefore, what's happening around the world does matter and affects every part of that global system. And therefore what happens offshore, well away from the US, has relevance for the US, whether we like it or not. Let me just give you an example. I mean, a US manufacturing company probably sources some of its raw materials, not necessarily all, but some of its raw materials or packaging materials or other inputs that it uses and consumes from suppliers that are outside the US, because the supply chain is a global supply chain and it's a very long supply chain in certain aspects. So if we take an example where a raw material supplier in a country in Asia or Africa or Latin America has, let's say, an issue with child labor. So I don't want to go to the environment, just let's talk about the social issues. Mm-hmm. There's an issue with child labor. Well, that issue becomes an issue for the US company because it does affect the reputation of the US company, because ultimately they will be held accountable for issues that occur within their entire supply chain. And that will give rise to legal and probably financial consequences on the US company. So as we operate in a global ecosystem, what happens anywhere is important everywhere. And that's why we certainly need good quality, robust global standards that ensure that we operate as best we can to the highest level of transparency and integrity, because that's what the public expects, that's what the public demands, and that's our public interest mandate to ensure we deliver against those high standards.
So I think if I can maybe summarize that, given that pretty much every company, one way or another, their supply chain reaches into other parts of the world, and given that increasingly many stakeholders think that companies have at least some responsibility for what happens in their supply chain, that even companies that are maybe not doing a lot of business outside the US have a vested interest in standards being in place and procedures to ensure compliance with those standards around the world, so that they can have a greater level of comfort, I guess, that things are operating properly in their supply chain, and that they're not going to be surprised with an uncomfortable headline in the newspaper about what's going on in their supply chain.
Yeah, could I maybe just throw something else in, if I may, Andreas? The issue also affects not only the reputation, which I referred to, but also the attractiveness of organizations. There's a war for talent around the world today in all professions, all businesses, and I was actually talking about that yesterday. And increasingly, the next generation is thinking very hard as to who they want to work for and how they want to work. So, companies have to have a purpose which is to do good for the society and make the place better tomorrow than it was yesterday. And that is going to require us to ensure that we deal with ESG matters well, because otherwise we won't actually find that the next generation wants to come and work in our kind of organizations in the future. And I was actually having a conversation with the senior partner of one of the big four yesterday evening just about this matter. And he was telling me that this is not just a regional issue, this is a truly global issue for his firm that they're trying to address. The other thing I would say is that, ESG matters will affect the sustainability of our business partners. So for a company in the US to really be sustainable in the long term, it needs to ensure that the partners it deals with, whether they are partners that provide input materials or partners that take their goods or services, are also sustainable and viable in the longer term. That's why it's not a national issue. This is a truly global issue, and we're all interconnected.
Okay, that's helpful. So, Alan, many of our viewers are obviously somewhere involved in the financial reporting ecosystem. And while I know you're not a lifelong accountant, you've certainly, in various roles you've had over your career, been close to the financial reporting ecosystem. So, sort of from your perspective, why is ESG relevant to sort of the finance function and other people that are involved in, I'll call it the world of financial reporting?
Well, interesting, Andres. I am a lifelong accountant, as I define accountant. Although I've worked the whole of my working life in FMCG and in retail, I'm a professional accountant. I'm not, of course, an auditor or a provider of assurance services, but I have been a user of those services over many years. As I've already said, we live in a global ecosystem, and environmental, social, and governance issues are therefore truly global issues. And there's a lot that we need to do, I would say, to address ESG issues, to ensure that we stop consuming more resources than are either available or that we produce. And I now hear people talking about us living off 1.7 planets. Well, there's only one planet, and if we're living off 1.7, as accountants, we know this means depleting resources, impairing vital assets, and therefore heading to insolvency very quickly if we're not careful. So, as accountants, we understand that. We understand the language of measurement, we understand the language of reporting, and that's why we need to engage on ESG matters, because it is not just a matter of survival, which in itself is important, but we are doing harm to this planet, and we need to address that. So why is ESG reporting therefore critical? It's critical for me because we need to measure transparently and accurately how much resources we are consuming and therefore depleting. We also need to measure how much sustainable resources we're actually creating and producing, because that's the only way we're going to get into a balance of sustainability on Earth. And we need consistent measurements and methodologies so society at large can, and therefore reporting, so that society at large can assess whether organizations are indeed becoming more sustainable over time. And COP26 is starting in 2 weeks' time. And we're going to hear, no doubt, lots and lots of promises of getting to net zero by 2035, 2040, maybe 2045 or 2050. But let's be honest, they are meaningless promises unless we have clear, measurable plans to get there, credible plans to get there, and that we can demonstrate over the course of the next few years that we're actually on the right path. And let's be honest, few of any of the leaders that are going to pitch up in Glasgow at COP26, whether they're business leaders or political leaders, few of, if any of them, who are going to be making these bold statements, will be in their leadership roles in 2035 to be held accountable for whether they have delivered the targets that they've set for themselves and their organizations in 2021. And therefore, we as a profession of professional accountants, whether we are preparers or whether we are those that provide independent assurance, we have a critical role to play to make sure that we avoid, I don't like to use the word greenwashing, but it's now everyday language, so I should use it, to make sure that we can be held, all of us can be held accountable, that we are actually delivering what we say. And there's no such thing as long-term, because for me, long-term consists of a series of short terms. And therefore, we need to make sure we're on track in the short term in order to be held accountable for what we are saying we're going to deliver in the long term. And, our profession, therefore, has a very important role to play. We have the skills, we have the knowledge, we have the expertise. It's what we do. It's what we've been doing. It's what we've been trained to do. And that's why I think our profession is so important in this ESG discussion.
Yeah, there's an old saying, right, that what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. And maybe going back to where we started with the valuation profession, what doesn't get measured doesn't make its way into value. And so
exactly.
I think you've made a very good case of the importance of measurement, and measurement is sort of what the financial reporting world is all about. So with that, Alan, I really appreciate your insights as always, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Andres, and it's good to see you and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.